Sweet promises given to all who
Welcome to Bible Talk class.
behold, I
We are continuing our presentation on the interpretation of the seven last plagues, the dramatization of God's judgment on the human agents of the devil. And here we are going to look at the nature of the plagues as we looked at the interpretation. The series of judgment imageries express full and holistic dramatization of God's judgment on the wicked, but not successive judgments. We are making this bold statement here that the seven last plagues should be seen as a full or holistic dramatization of God's judgment. Dramatized. Judgment is dramatized here. And that's what we want to stress. And the reason will be given below. Now, this dramatization is intended to provoke the earth dwellers and kings of the earth to prepare for the final battle where victory is assured of God. So the judgments, as we see with the seven last plagues, the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, they are all intended to prepare the wicked for a battle. And this battle will be won by God. And so it's only to dramatize, this war. And the war, as we know, is not going to be a literal war, as we will explain later on. And so if it's not going to be literal, then we must appreciate that the other plagues may not also be literal. And so let's look at them. Now, the personal and the impersonal imageries affected by the judgment imageries render the plagues symbolic of a sensual gradation of God's judgment for dramatization effect. The plagues affect human beings. They affect the seat of the beasts. And so there are things that are not real. We don't see them. But those things are also affected by the plagues. And so one has to appreciate that the personal and the impersonal imageries affected by the judgment imageries render the plagues symbolic of a sensual gradation of God's judgment for dramatization effect. The malignant saw the killing of sea creatures, drinking water turned to blood, and the heat of the sun are judicial language of divine displeasure. So when you read the Old Testament, you feel that these languages are used always to show God's displeasure of the deeds of the wicked people. The attack on the throne of the sea beast and his kingdom is a total symbolic rendering of the kingdom of this world non-existent. In other words, when the throne of the beast is attacked, what it simply means is that no earthly kingdom can exist when God begins to take his world back. No kingdom can exist because we have explained that the sea beast is a composite of worldly kingdoms which are presented in successive fashion by using 7 heads and 10 horns. And so what we see here is that once the throne of the beast is attacked, it means that no human kingdom can exist in the face of God's kingdom. And so that's the imagery that we find, the meaning, and it's very clear that it's symbolic. It's symbolic. So how will the 7 kingdoms or 10 kings be affected by the plagues? And if some of the heads, which are the kingdoms, have already fallen, how are they going to be affected by the plagues? The language here is to say that no human kingdom can exist in the face of God's kingdom. The symbol of the drying up of Euphrates indicates divine judgment on the global enemies of the kingdom. We have understood what River Euphrates means. Also that beyond Euphrates are the enemies of God. As one is dried up, according to the Greek historian Strabo, when the Persians dried up River Euphrates, they were able to attack Babylon and defeat Babylon. Anytime the language drying up of Euphrates is used, the defeat of Babylon is in view, and it means that humanistic establishment will come to an end and God's kingdom will be finally established. So that is the language that we find here. Now, the battle is a great day of the Lord Almighty, a consistent symbolism of God's judgment on the wicked, and that's what we find with the Maghedon, the battle at Maghedon. The unexpected announcement of the parousia serves as a literary purpose for the certainty, not eminence, of Jesus' coming, because he had executed judgment on the wicked. Judgment has already been executed on the wicked, and so the announcement here of the parousia is not futuristic, as the plagues are being poured. In other words, when the plagues are being poured, one should not expect that Jesus will still be coming the second time, and so people will have the chance to change their ways. That's not a picture, because when it comes to the 7 last plagues, there's no opportunity for repentance, and so that's the picture that we see, and that the function of the announcement here is only to help the reader of the book of Revelation that Jesus will indeed come, because we see that even after his second coming, in chapter 22, verse 7, verse 12, verse 20, the parousia is still announced as if it has not come. So the point is that the fact that it's announced during the 7 last plagues being poured doesn't mean that while the 7 last plagues are being poured, the expectation of Jesus coming is still, alive. No, the emphasis on the certainty that surely he will come. That's the point, and that the reader should remember this certainty. The symbolism of Armageddon indicates the assured victory of God over the enemies of the gospel, and that is the picture you find here. The expression "it is done," with its accompanying universal cataclysmic, echoes chapter 6, verse 17, signifying final victory over the kingdom of darkness. Chapter 21, verse 16. And so that's what you find. It is done. And that language simply, signifies final victory over the kingdom of darkness. And so that's what we see here. Now, the dramatic effect of the 7 last plagues registers God's power to punish the earth dwellers, whose masters, namely the dragon, the sea beast, and the land beast, remain powerless to protect. So when God is unleashing the plagues on earth dwellers and other impersonal imageries, the dragon can help, the sea beast can help, the land beast can help, and that should help any reader of the book of Revelation that is safe to pitch your tent with God, because he alone can protect, he alone can help, and that when he's pouring out his anger, no one is able to restrain him. When does God punish the wicked in the rest of the New Testament? This is what we want to look at. Follow me carefully here. The nature of judgment in the New Testament tradition suggests that before the second coming, the saints will be in tribulations and then delivered at the coming, or are taken to heaven, and the mourning wicked are left on the earth or cast into fire. This is a simple account of how God will judge the world. How God will judge the world. This sequence is clear in the New Testament. Okay? That before Jesus comes the second time, the saints will be in tribulations. Very clear. And then they will be delivered at the coming, or are taken to heaven, and the mourning wicked are left on the earth or cast into fire. Summarily stated in the New Testament. Revelation chapter 14 verses 14 to 20 portrays the sequential order of reward for the saints and the punishment of the wicked. We have 2 harvests there, and I've explained what the 2 harvests point to. Very clear. The sequence is very clear. The saints are rescued as first fruits, 144,000, great multitude. to heaven, saved, harvested. Now the second harvest, we see the language of winepress, indicating the destruction of the wicked or punishment of the wicked. The appearance of Jesus at his second coming is portrayed as war with the earth dwellers whom he will kill. Revelation chapter 19 verse 21. So the imagery is consistently portrayed, and we have different imageries also used to capture the judgment of God, as we mentioned in our hermeneutics of Revelation. And so we can see in chapter 14 harvest imagery is used, and so chapter 15, chapter 16, the language of plague is used. That's a point we want to underline here. The extinguishing of the wicked occurs after the millennium. This is the picture we see. After Jesus has returned the second time, then the millennium will happen, and after the millennium, then the wicked will be forever extinguished, forever eliminated. The imagery of a harvest should have ended earth history. Chapter 14, when you read the two harvests there, this imagery should have ended everything because we are done. But the question is, what happens to major forces and actors against God, the Lamb, and the redeemed? What happens to them? We want to know the details. The harvest only summarizes the judgment of the wicked and the reward of the saints. The seven last plagues as another symbolism of symbolizing a complete dramatization of the wrath of God are poured on the earth dwellers in response to the quest of the souls under the altar. The seven last plagues are different from the seventh trumpet in their scope, duration, and purpose, as outlined earlier on. The redeemed appear as spectators of God's wrath poured on the earth dwellers. Revelation chapter 15 verse 2, we see the saints standing on the sea of glass. Doing what? Thanking God for punishing the wicked. The redeemed had overcome the beast and his image and the number and his name, and this makes them able to sing the song of Moses, a symbol of the saints in heaven. So the symbol you find here is a symbol of the saints finding themselves in a different space, not so in the same space with human beings. And that's why we don't find the language of, say, the seven last plagues should affect 1/3 of the earth. If you find a language like that, then it means that not everyone on earth will be affected. Only those who do not have the seal of God. We don't find that language. The language you find is global. Global. And chapter 15 verses 2 to 4 make clear that the saints are standing somewhere. They don't share the same space with the wicked people. The statement who is and who was in Revelation chapter 16 verse 5 indicates that God reclaimed the kingdom of the world and began to rule, signifying the end of sinful world. Note here, friends, that when you read Revelation chapter 11 verse 17, the seventh trumpet is sounded, and when it's sounded, judgment of the wicked has started, and that God has taken the kingdom of this world and has begun to rule. And in that passage, the description of the creator being, who is, who was, who is to come, as found in chapter 1 verse 4, chapter 1 verse 8, chapter 4, also, we don't find who is to come in Revelation chapter 11 verse 17. What we find is who is and who was. There's no is to come because he has already come. And the same phrase, who is, who was, is found in Revelation chapter 16 verse 5. When the plagues are falling, it should be seen as God's coming, God's establishment of his kingdom. Simply put, God has begun to rule, just like we see in the seventh trumpet. And the seventh trumpet is a fulfillment of God's judgment of the wicked and establishment of his kingdom, and also the giving of rest to his people. So the same language is used with the entire 7 last plagues. So the phrase the wrath of God depicts God's judgment and victory over his enemies. Therefore, the 7 last plagues may symbolize the defeat of the wicked by the second coming. All that we are saying is that the 7 last plagues summarily represent the defeat of the wicked by the second coming of Jesus. That's all. Because verse 5 of chapter 16 makes clear that God, the Creator, who is, who was, has already come. And that's why there's no is coming attached to that, according to the Greek text that you find. And so that's how we look at the 7 last plagues. Now, contemporary relevance for our studies, contemporary relevance for our spiritual work today. Only those who have died to sin and earnestly seek divine power to maintain a Christ-like relationship with God and their fellow human beings in the environment will escape this complete wrath of God. The winner and the loser of the final battle has been determined, but the beneficiaries, hence the gospel. And so, the devil will lose, God will win. This determination has been done. But those who are going to either align themselves with the devil or God have not been determined. And that's why this message is a gospel, because you can change your post. You can change your destination as you make choices or respond to the good news today. Compromisers of the commandments of God and the faith in Jesus will be affected by the wrath of God, symbolized by the 7 bowls of plagues, complete measure of God's judgment. The gospel has an element of emotional fear of God for his destructive power. And Jesus made that clear in Matthew chapter 10, verse 28. God should be feared as one who can destroy. He's a loving God, but can also be destructive. If the dragon, the sea beast, and the earth beast cannot protect the earth dwellers, then it is safer to be with God now. That is the point we want to address here. That God has a power to judge, to pour out his anger, which is a summary statement of his final judgment against the wicked. And no one can restrain him. And that's the point. And so it's safer to be with him now. Thank you very much for staying with us up to this point. In our next presentation, we are going to look at the dramatization of God's judgment on humans, political powers, and beasts as enemies of the gospel. We have made clear that when the 2 harvests imagery are presented and the saints are harvested as first fruits of the earth, and the wicked are also harvested and grounded in a winepress, the story should have ended. But the question is, what happens to the major actors? Those who opposed, those who instigated, those who influenced the world to oppose the gospel, to persecute God's people. What happens to them? And so the book of Revelation is taking its time to really announce how each of these major actors will be dealt with, and how the saints also will be finally rewarded. And so in this next presentation, we're going to look at how the political powers, human institutions, will be affected by God's judgment. I know you'll be blessed, and so be a blessing to share our presentations with the world, with the church, and with your family, and continue to be a Bible Talk class member by telling your friends to subscribe to this channel so we can grow this community of faith. Thank you very much, and see you in our next presentation. Bye-bye.
Behold, I come quickly, mine own to receive. Hold fast till I come, the danger is great. Sleep not as do others.